Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and His kingdom. We are going to, I believe, have a remarkable opportunity to converse with one of, I believe, our time's most interesting intellects, a man who has been a longtime friend of mine and a great contributor to this program, and will, I know, today, in the course of a full hour of free-range conversation with the great Rod Martin. Let me set the stage for our conversation by talking about what I think of as kind of a theme for the program. Much is being made of toxic masculinity in American society. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I can tell you what the effect seems to be, and that is suppressing what has been, throughout human history, one of the most important attributes of a functioning, let alone a surviving society, namely that there is masculinity that protects men, women, children, the society, from the predations of others who exhibit masculinity in an often very toxic way. The sources of this effort to suppress so-called toxic masculinity in our society are numerous. Everything from feminism run amok to, the idea that soy is a contributor. But whatever the source, what we need, I believe, is more masculinity. And we need it right about now to protect our country and secure our freedoms. We're going to talk about all that with Rod Martin. He is the proprietor of a wonderful website from which I have drawn some inspiration for those remarks. And we're going to explore some of it with him now. You can find all of his musings, including, I'm very pleased to say, those of our previous programs, on rodmartin.org. You can subscribe to the Rod Martin Report, which you'll find there. And at the very least, you need to listen closely to what he has to say on subjects of importance to our time, whether they're in the national security lane, as we tend to focus on here, or whether they are of a more general cultural, religious, or economic character. He's a master of all of them, and we relish the chance to visit with him each week. Rod Martin, welcome back. It's good to have you, my friend.
Great to be here.
You are, among many other things, of course, the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future, and I hasten to add that Institute makes this program possible. I hope you will consider contributing to it at usfuture.org, if only to keep the lights on here at Securing America. Rod, talk to me about this idea that masculinity is a toxic thing, hazardous to a society, and in urgent need of, suppression, if not outright repression. And how's that worked out in other societies, sir?
Well, as you know, I was trained as a lawyer, so I'm going to start by rejecting the premise. It is not toxic to the society. It's toxic to the people who want to subvert the society. And you will notice that those people have quite a double standard when it comes to the masculinity of Hamas, or the masculinity of any of the rape gangs across Europe and England. It is just completely verboten to speak of the depredations of these people. But when you're talking about actually useful, positive masculinity, leadership, nobility, strength, gentlemanliness, all the things that are necessary to help keep civil society functioning, to keep families functioning, and we must not have that because, again, if you want to subvert society, the first and foremost thing you have to do is attack the family. So, in all these different spheres, we are feminizing the men, not in the positive sense of femininity, but in the Bible's term, effeminacy. And at the same time, we're masculinizing the women. So you end up with these pusillanimous, little pathetic males, certainly not men. And you end up with these boss babe women, and nobody's happy. There's a reason that almost half of women under 45, of marriageable age, are now unmarried because they can't find men they'd want to marry. And I don't blame them. But at the same time, a lot of the men can't find a woman that isn't just gonna rape him in divorce court eventually. So this is a total societal breakdown. It's a deliberate strategy, and it's intended to create dependency so that none of these people have good family structures or church structures or other intermediating institutions. What they have to turn to is the paternal state. And the state becomes their father and their husband and their source of all blessings and curses. That's what's really at stake. And I leave on that last bit about blessings and curses because it is a deification of the state. That is the socialist agenda in all eras, in all countries, and that's what we're seeing carried out through critical theory here instead of classic class warfare in America.
Wow. That was about as brilliant a rant as I've heard, and I think you've made so many points that we can easily fill the hour just teasing them out. But let me begin where you ended, Rod, because I think you've diagnosed the main culprit here, and that is cultural Marxism and its efforts to take down our society. And you've rightly pointed to, the family as target number one of the Marxists. Right behind it is faith. And, the fact that these two are intimately tied is a point that I definitely want to ask you to develop a little bit further. But just to stay with this idea that it's baked into the DNA, if you will, of Marxism to destroy. How has it worked out where this experiment has been applied elsewhere, sir?
Oh, it's been utterly catastrophic. So much so that the Marxists had to undo it, at least in part. Lenin, of course, famously abolished marriage and abolished families almost immediately upon taking over Russia. That was one of the foundational reasons for the Russian Civil War. So, of course, the Bolsheviks had to pull back off of that pretty hard. But the Marxist attack on the family did not let up. It just became a little more subtle. And you see that in communist societies everywhere and in socialist societies everywhere. In the United States, of course, it's much more subtle because critical theory as a whole is much more subtle. That's the cluster of political programs that were generated originally by the Frankfurt School, Horkheimer and all those guys, and their grandfather being Marcuse. And the thing that some of your audience might not fully realize, because I know I'm talking about people that very few people have ever heard of, what they may not realize is that there was a very active discussion in the first half of the 20th century about why class warfare hadn't worked, and they needed a new marketing approach.
Hold thought on that new marketing approach, what form it took, and what it has accomplished. Rod Martin is in the house. Stay tuned for more. Welcome back to more with our friend Rod Martin. He is an entrepreneur, by training, one of the PayPal mafia, they call him, back at the founding of that enterprise by Peter Thiel and company. He has been very active in public affairs. He has been a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention, among other things. He is the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future, and we are proud as we could possibly be of having him with us each week here at Securing America. Rod, you were just making a critical point that it turns out that when sold directly, this idea of destroying the family, destroying faith, leaving people impoverished, taking their money, giving it to somebody else arbitrarily, and the like, part of the classic communist model, doesn't actually sell very well. So there had to be a new marketing scheme in selling it, particularly in this country. Talk us through what that turned out to be and what effect it has had to the extent it has sold.
Well, that's exactly right. And, Marx, who was wrong about almost literally everything, was nevertheless correct in seeking to establish something, and by correct I mean effective, not morally legitimate. But he was correct in seeing the opportunity presented in the year that he wrote with Engels the Communist Manifesto of the growth of liberal revolutions. And of course, in 1848, you have liberal revolutions sweeping Europe, and they're all seeking to diminish the power of existing absolute monarchies, their aristocracies, and so forth, and transfer power to the people, at least in part. And Marx and Engels saw this as a great opportunity, because if we're going to tear down established authority for the first time in 2,000 years or whatever, well, heck, it's free form who gets to replace it. So they come up with this schema that is presumably about enabling and empowering the proletariat, which is to say the working class, and of course that all sounds really good, and it appeals to envy, because who are those rich people to have what they have? But the aim was simply to tear down authority for the purpose of creating a new monarchy and aristocracy, of which Marx and Engels and their minions would be the head. Well, the theory was that envy would do the work, and it turned out that actually wasn't sufficient in the exact industrialized countries that Marx predicted it would sweep first. So we get this revolution in Russia, which is an agrarian society at best, in 1917, and we get no such revolutions in Germany, where they predicted it would happen first, or Britain, and even more without susceptibility to this was the United States. So you have, in the 20s and 30s especially, an intellectual conundrum. How are we going to sell to these societies? How are we going to make them in our image? And how do we get them to overthrow their governments so we can run them? And of course, that's how you get the Frankfurt School, starting with its grandfather, Marcuse. You have, I'm sorry, Antonio Gramsci. Marcuse is actually Frankfurt School. With Gramsci, you begin to see the outlines of this. Then the Frankfurt School guys come back, and their scheme is brilliant. It's setting everybody against everybody so that everybody feels oppressed, everybody has someone to hate, and everybody needs the state to step in and vindicate them and vanquish their enemies. And that's how you have critical race theory, radical feminism, queer theory, all the different theories that we've all of a sudden been hearing about in the last 10 years. They're all subsets of the same thing, and they all come together in intersectionality, where we have a hierarchy of which minority is more or less important than the others. And it creates this idea of power dynamics. Everything in the world is defined in terms of who does and does not have power. And actual power is irrelevant to this. So Barack Obama, as president of the United States, leader of the free world, guy with the nuclear trigger, had no power because he was black. And you have to understand, Bubba in a trailer park somewhere has complete power because he's a white man. I mean, it's just absurd. But there's a reason why Joe Biden can say, if you're not for me, you're not black. Because all of these categories are defined ideologically, not on their actual characteristics.
Fascinating. So identity politics is assigned identities, not actual physical characteristics in every case. And the object, again, as you've said, I think, but it bears repeating, is to divide the society, to fracture it so that it can be taken over and ruled by an interested party. And that interested party would be typically of the radical left. Which brings me to another topic, and we'll wind up having to take a break here in a bit, but before we do, just introduce the topic. You've written a very powerful essay. Well, I guess it would be a condemnation as much as anything, of the Democrats' history, imbued by Marxism, especially of late, very much weaponizing these ideas of critical theory and dividing to conquer, but how they have approached race as a party, maybe you'd call it an ideology, but certainly as a political party, and guns and their control. And I would guess would be added to that makes crime as well. Something that we'll talk about in the context of what Donald Trump is doing to shake things up in the area of crime, busting and war on crime and all that, law and order, one might call it. So give us just a quick introduction to the history of the Democratic Party. You hail from the southern parts of the United States. You know very well the role the Democrats Party has played from its inception, really, but particularly during the Civil War era up to the present.
Well, we have to understand the war, no matter how much we wish to romanticize it as Southern boys, because, the South's going to rise again and all this stuff. And I grew up going to Civil War battlefield parks, and I get it. But the truth is, it was a war between the Democrat and the Republican parties. That's what it was. The Southern Democrats wanted to maintain slavery no matter what it took, and no matter how many people pretend otherwise. Go back and read the ordinances of secession, and all but one of the state ordinances of secession says plainly that the reason for secession is slavery and the maintenance of it. So they're doing this for that purpose, and the Northern Democrats joined in. The Northern Democrats are engaging in draft riots in New York and every manner of subversion, even down to after Atlanta fell and Sherman marched to the sea, the Democrat candidate for president of the United States, the North, McClellan, is running on a platform of letting the South go. So that's the history. And as soon as they lost the war, they just started trying to enact the same kinds of things again. And one of the key points, you're talking about the gun essay, go to rodmartin.org. It's a great essay. It's right at the top of the front page. But the Democrats had used gun control, even in the Dred Scott decision, as a way to keep black people from having the rights of citizens and having any chance of revolting. And after the war, they did the exact same things so that they could be terrorized by the Klan and kept in line. And you see that all through the South, and the history is clear, up to and including a Florida Supreme Court ruling talking about how gun control...
Hold the thought, Rod Martin. We're out of time. We have to finish it on the other side. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Rod Martin is with us. I regret to say that I got so caught up in his historical reporting on what the Democratic Party in the South, pre-Civil War and subsequent to it, did to, well, promote slavery, promote divisions, promote the, well, one might say, the forces that undermine a society that is strong and respecting of freedom. And Rod, I apologize for not giving you more of a warning that we had to take a break, but finish your really important thought about where the Democrats went with all of this.
Well, it's always been the same. I mentioned that Florida Supreme Court justice in 1941 talking about how gun control laws have never, ever been applied to white people, only to black people. Well, that's segregation era. Obviously, that's changed since. But you see how they actually act in practice. We've got no cash bail in all these Democrat jurisdictions. We're just encouraging the cartels to flood across the border. We're doing everything we can to help criminals run free. In fact, if you have a criminal illegal alien like Kilmar, Democrat senators will fly out of the country to try to free him and bring him back to Maryland. He's a wife-beating gangbanger, for heaven's sake. And that's
the Maryland man you're referring to.
That's where this all links back to critical theory. And, just as the French Revolution was a prototype for Marxism and the later communist revolutions that we saw in the 20th century, likewise, race slavery in the United States became, and Jim Crow with it, became a prototype for critical theory. And the Frankfurt School guys were very aware of this. What it showed was you could pit different groups in society against each other for reasons that had nothing to do with economics and be more effective than the economic argument had been. And you saw this...
The whole sort of class struggle theory that Marx had relied on. Yeah.
Yes, so you see this in the 1880s and 90s as the populist movement started to really take root and started to win state legislatures in various parts of the country. The old Southern boys took a look at that and said, not here. That isn't going to work. And so that's how you get Jim Crow more than any other single thing. That was their response. If we can get the poor whites and the poor blacks to hate each other, and we make it about the poor whites being victimized by these evil black people, and we're going to defend white virginity. Well, the ruling class stayed in power because the poor whites stuck with them instead of grouping up with the people who actually were their natural allies, and collectively they could have elected better governments throughout the South. This maintained the old segregationist Democrats' rule of all those southern states for a century. And okay, later on they decide, well, segregation didn't work. Not because we didn't like it, but because it has become unpopular. And now we're going to take up the cause of black people. Oh, wait, that's okay. We can still divide and conquer. So you see today a complete repudiation of Martin Luther King's thought. The idea of you should be judged by the content of your character and not the color of your skin is explicitly repudiated by critical race theory. It's explicitly repudiated by people like Ibram Kendi, who teach the exact opposite, that you must only be judged on skin color as ideologically defined.
And you are oppressed inherently by white people.
Why do you do that? Because of power dynamics. We have defined one side as oppressed and the other side as the oppressors. And those people can never be redeemed. There is no redemption for them. And the people who are in the oppressed class can never be guilty of anything. because they're oppressed. And whatever they do, genocide against the Jews in Israel, whatever it is, well, it's justified because we're occupied. And it's just absurd. It would not have been anything that any sensible person would have considered at any other time in history. And that links us back to what you said in the beginning. This is the core of the assault on masculinity, because strong leaders who take seriously their duty to protect women and guard civil society would take one look at this and say, "Are you kidding?" And they would just put a stop to it in all its different manifestations. So you have to tear down men and masculinity.
And Rod, tying back in something you touched on there at several points, you only get there from, the founders, let's say, via a process whereby these thoughts have been inculcated in young people to such a degree that it's their default setting. And the Frankfurt School's genius, as I have understood it, was not only in conceptualizing how do you divide people, but how do you ingrain that divisiveness in the society through generations of students that have been subjected essentially to the indoctrination of critical theorists and their adherents. Would that be correct?
And this is what requires what has come to be called the Long March through the institutions. They must capture the education system. They must capture the universities. They must capture anything that influences minds. And that's also why they must be against school choice, which they very consistently are, because you must not have any diversity. The people who are all about diversity all the time only see it in an intersectional light, and intersectionality requires ideological conformity. So, which, by the way, is exactly what you're seeing with Cracker Barrel this week. They want to make it look like literally everything else. It's why your Jaguar looks like a Kia. Everything has to look like everything else. It's why your fine art is a banana duct taped to a canvas. We must tear down beauty. We must enforce conformity. And we're going to call it diversity because, again, that appeals to these intersectional groups that we keep defining down into smaller and smaller numbers, because the smaller those groups are individually, the more they need the collective whole to have any chance against the oppressor. And ultimately, we're going to overthrow the oppressor once we get enough of a force to have the revolution.
Right. And we have enough masculinity on our side to do that and have stripped it from the other side. Let me ask you about this, Rod, and I want to tease out several of these points that you've been making. In the context of the United States military, we have, of course, an all-volunteer force. It turns out that, particularly prior to Donald Trump's return and the sudden encouragement that many Americans felt to enlist, we were facing a situation in which not many were signing up, and the vast majority of the population, if not too effeminate to serve, were too obese or too illiterate or too unqualified to serve, and for other reasons. And we're facing truly a desperate situation, overlaid on top of which was this critical theory crap, the whole Marxist divisive agenda, starting with this idea that what mattered was not your performance, your merit, your capabilities as a warrior, but, pick your identity issue.
Well,
talk about that if you would.
Yeah, if the aim is subversion of the current system to create a de facto aristocracy, a ruling elite that is not accountable to anybody, The chosen path of the left in our time has been these huge international organizations and cartels of corporations and so forth. And so
I call them the globalists, yeah?
Yes, and for that to work, you really need to tear down the idea of the nation state, which is the biggest single reason that, starting with Stalin, we've demonized the idea of nationalism, which is kind of interesting when you consider that nationalism is how you got India and Kenya and Poland, every country that used to be part of an empire. And what is an empire except rule by a distant foreign elite in a capital over which you have no say? That's exactly the position of the American founding fathers. No taxation without representation. The London Parliament has no say over the laws and taxes in Virginia and Massachusetts. And even if we share a king, we don't share that. So with all of that said, you have a need to tear down the biggest boy on the block. The strongest nation state by far is the United States. The one that upholds the sovereignty that nation states inherently have is the United States. The one that's too strong to really be torn down is the United States. So they go after the military and they go after patriotism.
All right, we're coming back to that point and how this particular form of totalitarian subversion joins forces with two others, the Chinese communists and their friends, and what I call the Sharia supremacists and theirs, and what it means for all of you. Be right back. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and welcome once again to Rod Martin, the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future and the author of the Rod Martin Report, a remarkable resource. I strongly commend to you that you subscribe to it at rodmartin.org. Take advantage of not only Rod's remarkable essays and insights and television appearances and the rest that's there, but also guest authors that he features that are also contributing to our understanding of some of the great challenges of our time and what we need to do about it. Rod, just to finish the thought that we started on there, you made the point, I think very elegantly, that what, for want of a better term, are globalists, elites seeking to impose their rule over everybody else, who have in common one thing. They've got different end states in mind and so on, but they are utterly aligned with, and therefore making common cause with, the Chinese communists and their various front organizations and fellow travelers and captured elites, for that matter, and the Sharia supremacists, the people who seek to bring about a caliphate that will rule the world in accordance with this Islamic totalitarian code of Sharia. That one thing they have in common, of course, is getting rid of us, because we are the impediment to any of those favored end states being realized. And, of course, if and when they do get rid of us, they will then turn on each other and try to decide who gets the lion's share of the spoils. So having a strong and capable military that helps keep at bay these sorts of threats, it's not sufficient, but it's essential. Having the masculine, testosterone and the merit-based performance as hallmarks of it, the strength that you talked about earlier, nobility, leadership, even gentlemanness, officers and gentlemen and all of that is in the crosshairs, of course, of the woke or cultural Marxists in their efforts to take us down. Donald Trump, to his great credit, Pete Hegseth to his and others in the ranks now who have been promoted, having found that those who were embracing this cultural Marxist agenda have finally been removed by Messrs. Trump and Hegseth and others. Are we on a path, do you think, and is it going to be in time to save our military from the critical theory agenda that has done such harm to it as well as our country more generally?
Yeah, I think so. It's amazing how quickly some of these things can be regenerated. We saw that after the fall of communism. You know, countries that had been suppressed economically for incredibly long periods suddenly sprung into bloom once they had freedom. When Reagan took over, you know, we had been having a recession every 2.5 years since the end of the war. And, you know, we're in the stagflation of Jimmy Carter and the Democrat majority then. They actually got up to a veto-proof majority in the U.S. Senate for half of Jimmy Carter's time and just ruined the economy. And within just a few short years, the American economy was booming. The military was back. You know, and a lot of this is because so much of the military is only there briefly. You know, they volunteer, they do their time, and then they get out. And so if you have a situation such as that which Joe Biden created, your recruiting is just in the toilet. I think they were hitting like 40%, or, you know, maybe they were 40% under, whichever it was. But under Hegseth and Trump, we meet the total annual recruiting requirement in just a few months. And the difference is just palpable. If you believe that your leaders actually care about you, don't intend to just expend you stupidly with idiotic rules of engagement, such as we were contending with under Obama and Biden in Afghanistan, if you actually think that you're there to win and not just to mark time for some globalist cause, and if you think your leaders actually are warriors, yeah, people sign up and they see it as honorable. They see it as noble. They see it as a calling. And that's transformative. Enough of those people get in the service. Some of them will stay. Some of them will retire out in 20 years or later. And they will be great leaders for this country into the future.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, but I cannot emphasize enough the point you just made, that victory has to be a hallmark of the profession that they are in. You will not attract that kind of talent. You will not correct course. You will not bring forth a new generation of leaders if it's just another exercise in muddling through, I think, which is the best that can be said for much of what we've done in wars to date, certainly since the World War II.
It's
decisive
exactly
victory.
What we've done since World War II. We have been ambivalent about the use of American power, which, you know, up to the point where you're keeping us from getting into stupid wars is good. But once you've committed force, you actually need to win. And we've had 5 wars, you know, 5 big wars. We've had a bunch of other interventions and things, but, you know, 5 big wars in the time since World War II. And we have just ignobly withdrawn, leaving everybody in disarray from 3 of the 5. It's just horrible. And honestly, we didn't handle Korea that well either. That has to change, and you're seeing that with Trump. If Trump commits force, he means it, and he means to get it to a reasonable conclusion. That's the right attitude. That's certainly what's in the new Pentagon, and we're going to see how that develops out.
Well, this is a point on which we might have a bit of a disagreement. I'm concerned that having used force quite impressively in Iran, he declared the war was over when decisive victory had not been achieved, and I think that still needs to be done. But I want to talk about something else that Donald Trump has done that I want to get your take on in connection with all of this, Rod. But we have to take a short break. We'll be right back with more for that. Welcome back to this final installment of a very special, very stimulating, very informative conversation with a man from whom we expect nothing less, and that would be Rod Martin. Rod is a dear friend of mine, as well as a very important figure in the conservative movement, notably in his capacity as a thought leader. And you can find his thoughts at rodmartin.org, as well as our Institute for the American Future. And Rod, I wanted to ask you about something else that President Trump has just done, which I must say strikes me as a prime example of the application, effective application of, for want of a better term, masculinity.
Yes.
Of providing the leadership, providing the security, providing the the nobility and the gentlemanliness and all the rest of it that you talked about as hallmarks of a not toxic masculinity, but a highly valued masculinity. And that is in connection with trying to do something effective against crime, which has been much in evidence in the nation's capital. And starting there, he has sought to do just that. To the horrified response of those Democrats and a few others, civil libertarians and the like. Give us your thoughts, sir, on the importance of what the president has done to date. As we speak, he was just in a press conference talking about the fact that for the first time in decades, there has not been a murder in the nation's capital in 11 consecutive days, and other benefits that have accrued as a result of having the kind of presence on the streets of federal law enforcement and National Guard, and his interest in possibly doing the same in other parts of the country that are crime-racked and in need of a little masculinity, it seems, other than in the hands, obviously, of the criminals. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, masculinity is, at its core, boldness, leadership, decisiveness, and, of course, protection of the weak. Now, that would not be how the Romans would have identified masculinity. That's not how Antiochus Epiphanes would have defined it by any means, but that is the Christian conception of it for 2,000 years now, and that has suffused Western civilization for centuries. So if you have an honorable police force, it actually exemplifies that possibly more than just about anything else you can point at. The police are there to protect the weak. They are there to deter the strong from victimizing the weak. And Democrats, of course, are horrified by that. They always depict the police as the enemy. They call them pigs. They spit on them. They defund the police. And of course, this absurdity of eliminating cash bail, which means that you have murderers and rapists back on the street within an hour of being arrested in the first place. Multiple offenders, just out running rampant. And this ties back to the critical theory discussion, because you need a lot of different minorities to add up to that new revolutionary majority that subverts and destroys the existing order. And criminals are an essential part of that. First of all, there are a decent number of them. But second, they provide the shock troops. Those are the guys Hitler recruited into the SA. Those are the guys that the communists recruited into Antifa in 20s and 30s Germany as well. This criminal element becomes the people who kill people and break things, and that is essential to the revolution, because what the people eventually demand is someone to establish order. And if a Donald Trump doesn't establish order in a constitutionally legitimate way, somebody else will come behind later and restore it in a completely subversive anti-constitutional way.
Yeah. And it's not just that it's consistent with the Constitution, it's that it is essential for the Constitution's continued application in a country like ours. Because, as you say, if you get the alternative, that will be over the side, as will our freedoms, as will, the country we love, as I said at the outset. So, Rod, what are your thoughts? It's clearly constitutional, as it's been applied so far, this policy of the president's in Washington, D.C. He's now talking about Chicago. He's talking about possibly New York, possibly Baltimore, and perhaps elsewhere. Talk to us about the constitutionality of that and the desirability of it, for that matter.
Well, the president clearly does not have the same powers in other cities that the Constitution grants the federal government in the District of Columbia. Nevertheless, does the president have power? Well, sure he does. There are all kinds of things that federal forces could do in those places, including guarding federal facilities, as we had to do in Los Angeles, and, of course, arresting federal criminals. There is way too much federal criminal law. I would really like to get rid of most of that, because most of that should be a state matter. But insofar as it is not, the president certainly has power to enforce those laws to some degree. So it'll be interesting to see how the Justice Department comes back with the exact parameters of what the president is able to do in a city like Chicago or New York. But the biggest single thing Donald Trump is accomplishing in even threatening them is he's forcing those awful Democrat city governments to actually crack down on crime in a way that averts the possibility. And we know they can do it. We saw Gavin Newsom clean up San Francisco when he wanted to impress Xi Jinping. So We know they know
Lickety split, actually. Yeah. We need a more systemic response to it, obviously, than just tidying up the mess. But, Rod, this is a really important assessment of where we are as a nation and why masculinity and strength applied in a constitutional manner is so important. Thank you for sharing all these thoughts. Come back to us soon if you would. I hope the rest of you do the same next time. Until then, go forth and multiply.